Every empire swears its money is safe. Rome's denarius, Spain's pieces of 8, Britain's gold sovereign, they all claimed their currency was as solid as the ground beneath your feet. But money isn't a thing, it's a promise. And the gold standard was the most convincing promise ever made. It said, this paper in your hand isn't just paper. It is a claim check for something real, something heavy, something that has been valuable for thousands of years. So why would any government willingly dismantle such a system? Why break the very anchor that supposedly guaranteed stability? The answer is that gold's greatest strength, its discipline, was also its fatal flaw. This system didn't collapse by accident. It was engineered to fail. Because when the choice is between financial discipline and political survival, discipline always loses. The gold standard had to fail because power always seeks greater freedom of action. To understand why it failed, you first have to understand the brutal, beautiful simplicity of how it worked. The classical gold standard, from roughly 1870 to 1914, wasn't just a policy. It was an architectural constraint built directly into the foundation of global finance. The rules were absolute. A nation on the gold standard promised to convert its currency into a fixed amount of gold on demand. This created an automatic balancing mechanism between countries. If Britain imported more from France than it exported, gold would flow out of London and into Paris to settle the bill. This gold drain from the Bank of England was a silent alarm. To stop the outflow and protect its reserves, the bank had to make Britain a more attractive place for money to stay. It did this by raising interest rates. Higher rates attracted foreign capital, but they also made borrowing more expensive for British businesses and citizens. The economy would slow, unemployment would rise. This was the system's disciplinary power in action. It forced a nation to correct its trade imbalances through internal economic pain. There was no central committee voting on it. It was mechanical, automatic, and merciless. This mechanism created what economists called the rules of the game. Central banks were not masters of the economy. They were its servants, forced to react to the flows of metal. Government spending was hemmed in by the reality of finite gold reserves. You couldn't finance massive deficits by printing money because every new note had to be backed by gold in the vault. The system was a cage, and the key was held by the market. This rigidity created an illusion of permanence in the late 19th century, a period known as the first era of globalization. Exchange rates were fixed, capital flowed freely. It seemed like a permanent natural order. But the scaffolding was beginning to crack under the weight of the very industrial growth it helped enable. The global economy was expanding at a pace that the slow geological trickle of new gold from mines could never hope to match. The system was designed for stability in a world that was increasingly demanding growth, credit, and most dangerously, the financial capacity for total war. The discipline was the point, but it was also the problem. That merciless discipline created the first major crack in the system, a political revolt. The problem was deflation. Because the money supply was tied to gold, which grew slowly, it couldn't keep up with the explosive growth of the industrial economy. When an economy produces more goods and services, but the amount of money stays relatively the same, the value of each unit of money increases. Prices fall. This sounds like a good thing. Your money buys more. But deflation is an economic trap. It rewards savers and punishes debtors. If you took out a loan to buy a farm when wheat was $1 a bushel, but deflation pushed the price down to 50 cents, your debt burden had effectively doubled. You now had to sell twice as much wheat to pay the bank. This crushed agricultural economies and rising industrialists who relied on credit to expand. The system designed for stability was creating profound instability for the majority of people who lived and worked on debt. This pressure erupted in the United States in the late 19th century. The populist movement, representing farmers in the South and West, saw the gold standard as a tool of Eastern bankers to enslave them. Their solution was bimetallism, using both gold and silver to back the currency. Silver discoveries in the American West meant that adding it to the monetary base would increase the money supply, creating the inflation that farmers desperately needed to ease their debt burdens. The conflict reached its peak in the 1896 presidential election. William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate, delivered his legendary Cross of Gold speech. He didn't just argue for silver, he framed the fight as a class war. "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns," he thundered. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The speech was a direct attack on the financial establishment. It was the political system declaring that the mathematical purity of the gold standard was unacceptable if it meant crushing the citizenry. Bryan lost the election. Gold won, but the rebellion revealed the fundamental vulnerability. The gold standard required not just economic compliance, but political consent. When the economic pain it inflicted became too great, that consent could be withdrawn. The system's rigidity made it a political target. It could withstand market forces, but it was ill-equipped to handle the anger of voters who felt its discipline as oppression. The architecture was strong, but the foundation, public willingness to endure deflation, was cracking. The first major test of the 20th century would show that when an even greater pressure emerged, the entire structure would be abandoned overnight. While the political rebellion against gold's deflationary pressure was simmering, the financial system itself delivered a stark warning. The The Panic of 1907 was the last major American financial crisis, managed not by a government institution, but by the sheer force of a private individual. It exposed the fatal flaw in the gold standard architecture, its inability to create emergency liquidity. The panic began with a failed attempt to corner the stock of a copper company. When the scheme collapsed, it triggered a run on the trust companies that had financed it. These trusts operated like banks, but were outside the stricter regulations of the national banking system. As fear spread, depositors rushed to withdraw their money, creating a classic liquidity crisis. The system, constrained by its finite gold reserves, began to freeze solid. Banks, fearing for their own survival, stopped lending to each other. The U.S. Treasury was virtually powerless. Without a central bank, it had limited ability to inject cash into the system. The monetary machinery was seizing up. Into this vacuum stepped J.P. Morgan. Effectively acting as a one-man central bank, Morgan summoned New York's leading bankers to his library. He locked the doors and forced them to pool their resources to provide liquidity and stem the panic. He dictated which institutions would be saved and which would be left to fail. His authority was the only thing preventing a total collapse. The lesson was terrifying. The stability of the entire American economy had hinged on the health and judgment of a 70-year-old private banker. The gold standard's rigid rules had no answer for a sudden crisis of confidence. It could maintain discipline in normal times, but it had no mechanism to act as a lender of last resort, an entity that could create liquidity from nothing to prevent a systemic failure. The political consequence was immediate and profound. The scare of 1907 created a powerful consensus that the United States could no longer rely on ad hoc rescues by financiers. It needed a permanent institutional lender of last resort. This led directly to the Jekyll Island meeting in 1910 and the eventual creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. The Fed was born from the recognition that the gold standard's discipline was insufficient. A modern economy needed flexibility, the ability to create money during a panic to save the system from itself. The Panic of 1907 was the warning shot. It proved that the gold standard's greatest weakness was its rigidity, and the solution was a new layer of financial control that could operate above its strict constraints. It was the beginning of the end for pure gold discipline, setting the stage for the far greater crisis that would shatter the system entirely. The Federal Reserve was created to manage the gold standard, not to replace it. But the system it was designed to protect was about to face a test for which it was fundamentally unprepared. The First World War was not just a military conflict. It was a financial revolution. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that the gold standard was a fair weather system, a luxury that nations could not afford when their survival was at stake. The discipline of gold met the unlimited demand of industrial warfare, and the discipline shattered. The numbers were staggering, unprecedented in human history. The war required the mobilization of entire economies. It meant building millions of rifles, thousands of artillery pieces, countless shells, and feeding, clothing, and transporting armies of millions. The cost was astronomical, dwarfing any previous government expenditure. Britain's national debt, for example, increased by a factor of 10. For governments bound by the gold standard, this presented an impossible equation. Their gold reserves were finite, but the financial demands of the war were infinite. So they made a choice. Within days of the war's outbreak, the major European powers, Britain, France, Germany, all suspended the convertibility of their currencies into gold. It was not a failure of the system. It was a deliberate, coordinated decision to abandon it. The anchor was cut loose because the ship was heading into a hurricane. To finance the war, they turned to the only tools they had left: massive debt issuance and the printing press. They created war bonds, appealing to patriotism to convince citizens to lend their savings to the state. And when that wasn't enough, they simply created new money. The central banks, including the new Federal Reserve, became engines of war finance. This suspension was always presented as temporary, a necessary emergency measure, but that was the psychological break. It proved that the gold standard was not an immutable law of economics. It was a policy choice. And when that choice conflicted with the state's most basic function, self-preservation in war, it was discarded. The genie was out of the bottle. Governments had discovered that they could finance themselves not through taxation or sound finance, but through the creation of credit and currency. The constraint was gone. The consequences were immediate and inflationary. The new money flooding the system chased a shrinking supply of civilian goods, sending prices soaring. But this inflation was tolerated because the alternative, losing the war, was unthinkable. The lesson was seared into the political consciousness. When faced with an existential threat, fiscal and monetary rules are optional. The gold standard, which had seemed so permanent in 1914, was revealed to be a contingent arrangement, a discipline that could be suspended in the name of a higher purpose. The temporary suspension of 1914 created a financial reality from which there would be no true return. The world had tasted the power of fiat money, and that taste would prove addictive. The war didn't just kill millions, it killed the idea that money had to be tied to something real. It established the principle that the state's need for resources trumped any external constraint. The door to the cage had been opened, and no one was in a hurry to close it again. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world faced a monumental task: rebuilding. And for the bankers and politicians who remembered the stability of the pre-war era, that meant trying to resurrect the gold standard. They craved a return to normalcy, to the predictable, disciplined world of 1913. But you cannot rebuild a collapsed building with the same cracked foundation. The system they created, the gold exchange standard, was a ghost of its predecessor. It was gold in name only, a fragile compromise that papered over the fundamental shift in power that the war had unleashed. The core of the new system was a clever but ultimately fatal deception. Instead of every major currency being directly convertible to gold, many smaller countries would hold their reserves in pounds, sterling, or US dollars, currencies that were themselves convertible to gold. The world's financial system was no longer built on a foundation of gold bullion. It was built on a foundation of faith in the British and American central banks. This created a pyramid. Gold was at the top, then the core currencies, and then everyone else's money. It was efficient, but it concentrated immense systemic risk. The entire structure now depended on the credibility of London and Washington. Britain, desperate to reclaim its pre-war financial prestige, made a catastrophic error. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war parity. This meant that the British pound was once again worth the same amount of gold as it had been in 1914. It was a decision driven by pride, not economic reality. The problem was that the British economy had been devastated by the war, while the American economy had boomed. To make the pound worth its old gold value, it had to be artificially strengthened. This made British exports prohibitively expensive on the world market. The result was a slow-motion economic suffocation. British industry, particularly coal mining, became uncompetitive. To defend the overvalued pound, the Bank of England had to keep interest rates punishingly high, choking off domestic investment and growth. The gold exchange standard, designed to restore stability, was locking Britain into a depression years before the rest of the world. The discipline of gold was back, but the economy could no longer bear its weight. The fundamental weakness was now exposed. The system was backed not by the immutable certainty of metal, but by the perceived strength of a few key currencies, and that perception was fragile. When the Great Depression began in 1929, it triggered a global scramble for liquidity. Countries and investors rushed to convert their pounds and dollars into the one asset they truly trusted: gold. The pyramid began to crumble from the bottom up. The pressure on Britain's gold reserves became unbearable. In September 1931, after a massive speculative attack on the pound, Britain was forced to do the unthinkable. It abandoned the gold standard entirely. The collapse was swift and total. The country that had been the anchor of the global financial system for a century had been the first major power to break. The failure of the gold exchange standard proved that the world could not go back. The war had permanently altered the balance of economic power, and any attempt to resurrect the old discipline was doomed. The system hadn't just failed, it had demonstrated that the very concept of an external monetary constraint was incompatible with the new reality of massive public debt and democratic pressures. The failed resurrection set the stage for the final, chaotic act of the gold standard's demise, where the United States would face the same impossible choice. Britain's abandonment of the gold standard in 1931 sent a shockwave through the global financial system. It wasn't just a policy change, it was an admission of defeat. The country that had authored the rules of the old order had just torn up the rulebook. For the United States, still clinging to gold, this created an impossible situation. The Great Depression was not just an economic collapse. It was the gold standard's final catastrophic failure. The very mechanism that was supposed to provide stability became the primary engine of the downturn, amplifying a recession into a worldwide depression. The system worked with brutal mechanical logic. As banks began to fail and panic spread, people did what the gold standard taught them to do. They sought safety in the ultimate asset. They rushed to convert their deposits into gold. This created a devastating deflationary spiral. To meet these withdrawals and protect their dwindling gold reserves, surviving banks had to call in loans and stop lending. Credit, the lifeblood of the economy, froze solid. Businesses that relied on this credit to operate couldn't pay their workers or suppliers. They failed, unemployment soared, and demand for goods collapsed, which drove prices down even further. The gold standard, in its relentless defense of currency value, was systematically destroying the real economy. It was saving the money by killing everything the money was supposed to represent. The international dimension made it worse. In a desperate attempt to protect themselves, countries still on gold engaged in beggar-thy-neighbor policies. They raised tariffs, trying to shield domestic industries by making imports too expensive. But this only shrank global trade further, deepening the crisis for everyone. The logical next step was competitive devaluation. A country that left the gold standard could devalue its currency, making its exports cheaper on the world market and stealing demand from its competitors. Britain's departure gave it this advantage. Countries that clung to gold, like the United States and France, saw their exports become increasingly uncompetitive, sucking more gold into their vaults while their economies stagnated. The system designed for cooperation had become a mechanism for economic warfare. For the United States, the pressure became unbearable. The Federal Reserve, terrified of a run on its gold reserves, actually raised interest rates in 1931, exactly when the collapsing economy needed stimulus. It was the gold standard's discipline enforced at the worst possible moment, crushing any hope of recovery. By 1933, the American banking system was in terminal seizure. State after state declared bank holidays, temporarily closing their doors to prevent total collapse. Public confidence was shattered. Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration in March 1933 marked the definitive end. His first major act was to declare a national bank holiday, shutting down the entire U.S. banking system. Then, he took the step that severed the final link between the American people and the old discipline. Through a series of executive orders and the Emergency Banking Act, he made it illegal for U.S. citizens to own monetary gold. They were forced to sell their gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve at the official price of $20.67 per ounce. It was a stunning confiscation of private property, justified as a national emergency. The final act came when Roosevelt took the United States off the domestic gold standard. The promise that had defined the dollar for generations, that you could always exchange it for gold, was revoked. The government had broken its own contract. The immediate effect was to free the Federal Reserve from its golden handcuffs. It could now pump liquidity into the crippled banking system without fear of a gold drain. It could pursue policies aimed at creating inflation to counteract the devastating deflation. The system had failed to provide stability when it was needed most. In its final act, the gold standard proved that its rigid discipline was a death sentence in a modern economic crisis. The cage was broken open, not to release chaos, but to allow for survival. The failure was total. The discipline was dead. The question was no longer if the world could return to gold, but what would replace it. The collapse of the gold standard in the 193s left a vacuum. The world had seen the chaos of competitive devaluations and trade wars, and the Allied powers were determined to build a new system that could prevent another depression and foster post-war reconstruction. In July 1944, as World War II still raged, delegates from 44 nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was not to restore the old discipline, but to create a managed alternative. The system they designed was a brilliant, unstable compromise, the last gasp of gold, built on a foundation that guaranteed its eventual failure. The Bretton Woods Agreement was a recognition of a new global reality, American supremacy. The United States emerged from the war not just victorious, but economically dominant. It held over two-thirds of the world's official gold reserves. The new system was built around this fact. The US dollar was anointed as the world's primary reserve currency, and it alone would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. All other currencies would have fixed, but adjustable exchange rates to the dollar. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, was created to provide short-term loans to countries facing a balance of payments problems, preventing the kind of deflationary spirals that had crippled the 1983s. The World Bank was established to fund long-term reconstruction and development. On the surface, it seemed like a return to gold-backed stability, but the trick was in the structure. The world's money was now backed by a promise on the US dollar, which was in turn backed by a promise on US gold. It was a system of layered trust, with the US Treasury at its center. For the first 2 decades, it worked spectacularly. It provided the stability needed for the post-war economic miracle in Europe and Japan. The dollar became as good as gold, and America's deep gold reserves gave the system an aura of permanence. But the system contained a fatal flaw, identified by the economist Robert Triffin in the 196s. It became known as the Triffin dilemma. To supply the growing global economy with the dollars it needed for trade and reserves, the United States had to run persistent balance of payments deficits. It had to pump more dollars into the world than it took in. But as those dollars accumulated overseas, the claim on U.S. gold reserves grew larger and larger. The system required the U.S. to act against its own interest. To provide global liquidity, it had to undermine confidence in the dollar's ultimate convertibility. The country that was supposed to be the anchor of the system was forced to erode the very foundation it stood on. The dilemma was impossible. If the U.S. stopped running deficits, it would starve the world of dollars, causing a global liquidity crunch and recession. But if it continued, eventually the amount of overseas dollars would dwarf the U.S. gold supply, making a run on Fort Knox inevitable. The system was designed to fail from the beginning. It was a temporary bridge between the world of commodity money and the world of pure fiat currency. By the late 196s, the bridge was cracking. The costs of the Vietnam War and domestic social programs led to inflation, making U.S. exports less competitive and worsening the balance of payments deficit. European nations, led by France under Charles de Gaulle, began to suspect the U.S. was exporting its inflation to the world. They started to do what the system allowed them to do. They exchanged their growing stockpiles of dollars for U.S. gold. The U.S. gold vaults began to drain. The promise of Bretton Woods, that the dollar was as good as gold, was being called, and America was running out of the metal to make good on its promise. The last gasp of the gold standard was running out of air. The pressure building against the Bretton Woods system was no longer an economic theory. It was a physical drain on the U.S. Treasury. By the summer of 1971, foreign central banks held over $40 billion in US dollars, while the US gold stock had dwindled to just $10 billion. The math was undeniable. If every nation demanded what they were legally entitled to, the United States would be bankrupt. The system's fundamental contradiction, the Triffin dilemma, had reached its breaking point. President Richard Nixon faced a choice that was really no choice at all. He could either defend the dollar's gold value by raising interest rates and imposing austerity, plunging the American economy into a deep recession right before an election year, or he could break the promise. On August 15, 1971, in a televised address to the nation, he chose the latter. He announced a new economic policy, and its centerpiece was the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. He closed the gold window. Foreign governments could no longer exchange their dollars for the metal that supposedly backed them. The official justification was to combat inflation and protect American jobs. But the real message was a declaration of monetary sovereignty. The United States was unilaterally withdrawing from the financial architecture it had created. The cage door, which had been left ajar since 1914, was now officially and permanently kicked open. There was no grand international conference, no negotiated settlement. It was a unilateral act of financial power. The temporary measure, of course, became permanent. The final fragile link between the world's currencies and a tangible asset was severed. The era of commodity money was over. The immediate aftermath of Nixon's decision was a period of chaotic experimentation. Without the anchor of gold, currencies began to float against each other, their values determined by the market's perception of a nation's economic strength rather than its stockpile of metal. This new architecture transferred ultimate monetary power from the impersonal discipline of gold to the deliberate judgment of central bankers. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan. These institutions were now the true architects of the global economy. Their new tools were interest rates, and eventually, quantitative easing. Instead of reacting to gold flows, they could now proactively manage the economy. To fight recession, they could lower rates and inject liquidity. To fight inflation, they could tighten. This was a power that would have been unimaginable under the gold standard. But this flexibility came with a new, silent tax, inflation. With the hard constraint of gold removed, governments could now run persistent deficits, financing their spending by issuing debt that central banks could effectively monetize. The value of your savings was no longer protected by a physical limit. It was now subject to the decisions of a committee. The trade-off was stark. We exchanged the external discipline of gold for the internal control of central authorities. We gained the ability to fight economic downturns aggressively and finance modern welfare states. But we lost the assurance that money would hold its value over generations. The question was no longer whether the gold standard had failed, but what we had sacrificed for this newfound control. The system didn't collapse. It was upgraded to a version that gave a handful of people unprecedented power over the global financial system, with consequences we are still navigating today. This entire history reveals a pattern that transcends economic theory. It is a pattern of power. The gold standard did not fail because of a technical flaw. It failed because it represented an external constraint on state sovereignty, and no external constraint can survive the state's fundamental need for self-preservation and expansion. The lesson is not comforting, but it is true. Systems break when they conflict with the imperative of power. The rigid discipline of gold was incompatible with the two defining projects of the 20th century, the modern warfare state and the modern welfare state. Both require the ability to mobilize vast resources on demand, to spend beyond current means, to manage economies, and to finance promises with future revenue. A gold standard, which limits the money supply to the pace of mining, is an obstacle to all of it. This is the recurring theme from ancient Rome to the present. Rome debased its currency to pay its legions. The monarchs of Europe clipped coins to fund their wars. The pattern is that the integrity of the currency is always the first sacrifice when the state's power is threatened or its ambitions expand. The 20th century simply scaled this ancient principle to an industrial level. World War I was the ultimate proof. When survival was at stake, the gold standard was not just abandoned, it was revealed to be disposable. We see this pattern repeating today with the proposals for central bank digital currencies. The promise, once again, is efficiency and stability. But the underlying architecture is about control. It is about replacing the messy, decentralized system of cash with a perfectly traceable, programmable, and centrally controlled digital token. The evolution is clear, from the external discipline of a physical commodity to the managed flexibility of fiat currency, to the potential for absolute digital control. The direction of travel is always toward greater centralized authority over the medium of exchange. The gold standard had to fail because it stood in the way of this historical progression. It was a relic from an era when money was a tool for trade, not a lever for total economic and social management. The gold standard failed because we traded its discipline for a different kind of power. We chose the control of central authorities over the constraint of a physical limit. The question is not whether the system was doomed, but what we lost in that exchange, and what we gained. The ability to manage crises and fund modern society came at the cost of placing ultimate monetary power in the hands of a few. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look next.